Welcome back to another episode of Susie Reads. If you remember right, we're reading, which is Ghosts and Goblins again. And if you remember right, last time, Miranda and the imp traveled to which city to get a broomstick for the king of the goblins. But Miranda's cousin, Demona, the queen of the witches, said no, and they returned empty-handed. Miranda says she has a plan. What do you think it will be? Shall we read and find out? Let's get started. Chapter 14, Surprise. The royal garden of the great palace in the land of the goblins is famous for its jeweled flowers, talking statues, and marvelous marble fountains. On special goblin holidays, the king even opens the royal garden to the public. It is well known throughout the land. The king's private garden, however, has been seen by only a special few. Frankly, he prefers it to the fabled royal garden. Here, in his private garden, the flowers are real. The royal gardener has cleverly arranged great beds of plants for every season, thousands of tulips for spring, beautiful roses for summertime, chrysanthemums of every color for the fall, and flaming poinsettias for wintertime. Sometimes, just for fun, and with a little goblin magic, he has them all bloom at once, as they are now. The king loves to come here, particularly after a busy day, sit by the royal fish pond and watch the sun set. Now that the queen is gone, he is usually alone. It is his private place to think of all the royal problems he has to solve and it is his private place to think of all the royal problems he has solved and all those he has yet to solve. It is here, in this very special garden, that he will summon Miranda and the imp to report on the third and final quest. Polly and Oliver will be here too. There is no doubt but that the king considers this to be a most important occasion. Miranda and the imp glided down very quietly and landed noiselessly on the beautiful emerald lawn of the royal garden in the land of the goblins. Not until Miranda was opening the glass door to the apartment of the great palace did Polly and Oliver know that the witch and her small companion had returned. After one look at Miranda's face, it was plain to Polly and Oliver that the quest for the broomstick for the king of the goblins had not been a success. The plump little witch stood by silently while Imp told of their encounter with Demona, queen of the witches, and of the exciting air battle on the way back to the land of the goblins. With all my magic, Miranda said, I was a failure. Polly and Oliver went to her side. Polly gave the sad little witch a hug. Never mind, Polly comforted her. We'll think of some way to get a broomstick for the king, and then we'll ask him for another try. Oliver nodded. He seems to be nicer than at first. Sometimes I think he likes us. He'll give us another chance, I'm sure. Miranda smiled a little wistfully. I do have a plan, she announced to them. There's no point in delaying things. Let's ask to see the king immediately. She knocked on the hallway door. A guard quickly opened it and looked at her inquiringly. Be a good goblin, she told him, and run tell your king that Miranda and the imp are back from which city. All of us here would like to see him as soon as possible. The guard trotted off. We might as well get ready, Miranda said, and disappeared into the bedroom. In a minute she was back. What are all these costumes in there? She asked Polly and Oliver. New clothes, Polly answered. Compliments of the king. Just after you and the imp left, the guards brought them with a note from the king saying that he hoped we'd find them to our liking for the celebration. What celebration? The imp asked. Oliver looked sad. This celebration we won't be having, he answered. The celebration in honor of the success of the third and last quest. Miranda cleared her throat. Oh, yes, there will be a celebration, she stated. I guarantee you that. Now, let's dress up for the king. She held up a beautiful scarlet dress and checked it for size. You know, she said, sending us new clothes was really sweet of him. By the time the guard returned to take them before the king, the four of them were dressed in their new finery. Miranda still wore her rather battered peaked hat with the 3 orange flowers and the green feather. But in place of her patched black dress, she now had on a lovely scarlet dress the king sent. Over it, she wore a long cape of black velvet, which he had also included. Miranda swirled, staggered a bit, and clutched her broomstick for support. Fit for a queen, she remarked. Since the imp was a brownie, and brownies always prefer brown, his suit was brown. However, it was made of satin so shiny that he all but glittered when he walked. To top it off, the king had included a bright orange tie. The imp had never before looked so elegant. Polly's dress was a party gown like none she had ever seen before. It was floor length and beautiful gold-colored sash. Wearing it, she felt quite grown up. So did Oliver feel grown up, and his long pants fit perfectly, as did his handsome jacket. The top hat which the king had sent along was the crowning glory. The guard could not conceal his admiration and beamed at them. The king will see you in his private garden. Follow me, he said. The king of the goblins was waiting for them by the side of the fish pond in his private garden. The flowers bloomed everywhere. He had been feeding one of the royal peacocks, which strutted away as Miranda and her group approached with the guard. With a snap of his fingers, the king dismissed the guardsmen. It was the first time that Polly, Oliver, Miranda, and the imp had been alone with the king since their arrival in the land of the goblins. Turning toward them, the king smiled sadly. Why are you wearing your new clothes? He asked. There can be no celebration. The third and last quest was a failure. How did you know? The imp asked. A king must be informed. The ruler answered. My spies reported from which city that Demona was impossible to deal with. He stepped forward and placed his hands on Miranda's shoulders. You made a noble try, dear Miranda. I cannot tell you how much I regret that it failed. Miranda smiled. But your majesty, she returned, it did not fail. I have brought you what you requested. With a curtsy, she presented her broomstick to him. It is yours, she said simply. You would give me your own broomstick? The king queried. Miranda, my dear, I cannot accept. Nonsense, Miranda exclaimed. It is of no use to me. She took a step to one side where she could see all of them. I have decided to retire, she announced. A witch without a cat is not much use, nor is a witch much of a witch who sometimes forgets her magic words. If I should try to go on with my good witching, I am sure Queen Demona would make it quite difficult for me. The king started to say something, but Miranda held up her hand. There's no use arguing, she said. I have made up my mind. I shall return to Mysterious Castle and try to be a better housekeeper. Perhaps I shall write a book about my witching days, or perhaps I shall simply doze by the fire and dream of them. The imp wiped away a tear. Oliver tried to swallow the lump in his throat. Polly ran and threw her arms around Miranda. May we go visit you? She asked. That would be very nice, Miranda answered. It was now the king of the goblins who held up his hands. I accept I accept the broomstick, he said, and now I declare the third and final quest to be a success. No one cheered, for Miranda to give up her own broomstick was too big a price to pay for the good news. The king again placed his hands on Miranda's shoulders. I have something more to say, he told her. I accept your broomstick on one condition only. They waited to hear what new demand he would make. He cleared his throat. I accept your broomstick, the king repeated, on condition that you share it with me. Miranda looked puzzled. I don't understand. I don't understand what you mean. I mean, the king said, that I want you to be my queen and share my throne with me. He's asking you to marry him, the imp cried, jumping up and down with excitement. And then you both could fly about the country on the broomstick, Oliver added. And Mysterious Castle could be your vacation place, exclaimed Polly. Oh, Miranda, please do. Miranda smiled to the king. This is quite a surprise, Your Majesty. I shall have to think about it. The king appeared to understand and summoned an attendant to take them back to their apartment. Dismiss the guards, he told the attendant. These are my honored guests. He kissed Miranda's hand. I shall be awaiting and hoping that your answer will be yes. Miranda and her friends returned to the apartment. It took Miranda exactly 2 hours, 13 minutes, and 47 seconds to make up her mind. She came out of the bedroom, where she considered the king's proposal and smiled at Polly, Oliver, and the imp. I have reached a decision, she announced. What is it? What is it? The imp asked. Miranda ignored him. It really wasn't difficult, she went on. I have grown quite fond of the king since we came here. I think, too, the land of the goblins needs a queen. Yes, I have decided to marry him. I shall not have to retire after all. Her three friends cheered. They were happy for Miranda. Long live the queen, shouted the imp. Long live good Queen Miranda. If only we had found cactus, Miranda remarked. My happiness would be complete. The wedding was held in the king's private garden, and never had it looked so lovely. With another touch of magic, the royal gardener had filled the trees with orchids in bloom. The royal decorator had lanterns of every color hanging all around. The royal musicians played softly as the wedding party approached the bower of roses, where Miranda and the king of the goblins were to be married. The imp, dressed in his brown satin, was at the head of the procession. On a velvet pillow, he carried the 2 rings of purest gold that Miranda and the king were to exchange during the ceremony. Polly, in her long party dress, was the maid of honor. Oliver was best man to the king. The entire royal court was present. For many, it was the first time they had seen the king's private garden. All those present agreed that they could not remember when they had seen the king so happy. As Miranda, in her regal scarlet dress, walked forward to meet him, his smile grew even wider. Around Miranda's neck hung the perfect pearl that Oliver and the imp had brought back for the king. On her head, instead of the battered peaked hat, was the most beautiful crown in the world. I have only one gift for my king, Miranda said after the ceremony was completed. Once again, she handed him the broomstick. The king accepted it with a low bow. The pearl and the crown are not my gifts for you, he said. They were not really mine to give. Polly, Oliver, and the imp made those gifts possible. The royal court nodded in agreement. But I do have a gift for Queen Miranda, the king announced. He clapped his hands, and 2 goblins appeared. Between them, they carried a large basket with a pink satin bow tied to the handle. Miranda ran forward. Cactus, she exclaimed. Wherever did you find her? My good goblin scouts, the king told her, are to be thanked. They found her in your own mysterious castle, Miranda, where she had hidden herself in a secret room for reasons of her own. Miranda took the basket from the goblins. Oh, she said in surprise. As you can see, the king remarked, Cactus was not alone when she was found. There in the basket were 3 kittens, the color of midnight, and on their foreheads were white markings that looked like stars. Cactus, scolded Miranda. You ran away to have your kittens. You should have known I'd be delighted. Cactus purred. When the kittens played with the ribbons on the basket, the royal musicians struck up a tune, and then their king and queen, leading the royal guests, waltzed on and on. At last the king and queen stopped before the imp and Polly and Oliver, who were quite full of wedding cake and ice cream. But the imp looked puzzled. What of me? He asked. What happens to me now? You will live with us, Miranda said firmly. The king added, It is hereby announced that you are royal imp of the court. And what about us? Polly and Oliver asked together. Thanks to your help, Miranda said gently, I am the happiest witch and queen anywhere. Your work is over, and it is time you are returned home. The children nodded. But may we come see you again? Polly asked. We never really learned to fly a broomstick, and you promised, Oliver reminded her. I am sure you will return, Miranda replied. And now the party is over. Polly and Oliver were suddenly so sleepy they could hardly find their way back to the apartment where they had stayed. It had been a day of great surprises. And that is the end of chapter 14. Next time, we will return to Polly and Oliver's house. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Susie Reads, and we'll see you next time when we finish Witches, Ghosts, and Goblins.